Okay.
Thank you. I'm going to introduce you there, if I may. So as chair of the the Federal Committee of the Plant Conservation Alliance, I'm pleased to welcome our speaker today, Chef Sean Sherman. He's founder and CEO of the Sous Chef and co-founder of North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems, or NATIVs. I'm not sure if I've pronounced that correctly. I'm really excited to hear about that. And so without further ado, speaking to us today about reestablishing native foodways, let's welcome the chef. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you guys so much for this opportunity just to share the story that I'm going to give you. I do this talk quite a bit. My name is Sean Sherman. I am from Pine Ridge, South Dakota. I am enrolled with the Oglala Lakota Sioux tribe. I have a business in Minnesota called the Sous Chef, spelling SIOUX, where we focus on North American traditional indigenous foods. And I'm just going to kind of talk you guys through a PowerPoint and just kind of go from there. If people want to do some questions, there should be a chat box, and I think somebody will be able to help field some questions at the end of this. But I'm just going to go ahead and jump right into the PowerPoint. So give me 2 seconds while I share my screen. All right, so I hope we're good there. So anyways, my name is Sean Sherman, like I said, and hopefully my internet will be okay. I'm actually in Yucatan for my partner's birthday tomorrow, so I'm in a resort and somebody's mowing right outside my window. Unfortunately, it's just timing. But anyways, I just want to talk to you guys a little bit about the work that we do. We have a restaurant in Minneapolis called Owamni by the Sous Chef. Owamni is right downtown Minneapolis. It sits right on the Mississippi River. We feel very lucky that this first restaurant that we've created is in the space where it's at. Owamni was named after what used to be a really beautiful waterfall, what is downtown Minneapolis. And the Dakota name of that waterfall was called Owamni Yamni, which meant place of the falling and swirling waters. And there was a lot of natural whirlpools there, and it's a very sacred space. And for the Dakota people that lived in Minnesota, or what is Minnesota today, the entire Mississippi, which is named Hahawakpa, which translates to River of the Falls, meant that exact location because it's the main. It was the main waterfall on the Mississippi River. So our food has really been focused on just trying to showcase what is possible for modern day indigenous foods, but thinking about it bigger. So it's not just about the restaurant. We also have the nonprofit NATIVs, which is the acronym North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems, NATIFS.org, and we're doing a lot of pieces there, which we'll talk about, but mainly focused on education, indigenous-focused education, and creating food access into communities. So for myself, I was born and raised on Pine Ridge, South Dakota, which is a fairly large reservation. Pine Ridge is close to the size of Connecticut, but we have basically one grocery store to service that entire area. When I was growing up, we had no restaurants, so a lot of our families survived a lot from the Commodity Food Program and the FDPIR program. And we have a lot of health issues because of the lack of nutritional access on tribes like mine. So there's a lot of intense food-borne illnesses like obesity, heart disease, and immense amount of type 2 diabetes. So the work that we're doing is really trying to showcase what's possible with indigenous foods. And it's also addressing some of these questions as to why aren't there Native American restaurants in every single city showcasing the food of the original food of the land that we happen to be standing on today.
Chef Sean Sherman, I think that you went on mute.
Oh, I'm so sorry. No,
I can hear you again.
Okay. All right, you can hear me? Okay, I'll just keep going unless you say something.
Yes, sorry.
That's okay. So hopefully my internet connection does look fairly strong, but I am in Mexico, so anything can happen. But we'll just try to push through. Um, so anyways, I did eventually move from South Dakota to Minneapolis and Minnesota when I was very young after working restaurants all through high school and college. And once I got to Minneapolis, because I had such a strong work ethic, I just moved my way up to a chef rather quickly, excuse me. And I worked for many different kinds of styles of foods. I worked for Spanish restaurants, French restaurants, Italian restaurants, some Japanese restaurants, and worked for a lot of farm to table, just buying a lot of food directly from farmers and growers around us, especially when it was still kind of up and coming in the very early 2000s. And, you know, it was a good chef career. I had lots of good reviews, and I was able to, you know, really grow as a young chef. But eventually I kind of got to a point where I just realized the absence of indigenous foods. I realized I had been studying foods from all over the world, that I can name, you know, hundreds of European dishes easily off the top of my head, and the recipes in the languages from there, but knew really just a handful of Lakota recipes of what my ancestors would have been eating. So it just really got me focused on trying to understand, you know, basically what are indigenous foods of North America. And what does that mean for me and my family? And, you know, so what were my ancestors eating? What were they growing? What were they harvesting? Were they trading with other tribes? What was the history of everything? And how far back did I have to even look? To my ancestry to see who was the last in line of my family to hold 100% of indigenous knowledge and food understanding. And I didn't have to go back very far, because really it was just my great-grandfather's generation, because I was born in 1974 and I looked at 100 years before my birth. In 1874, my Lakota ancestors were still surviving primarily the way they always had been, because they don't discover gold in the Black Hills until 1876. So it took less than a century for so much to disappear. So that really kind of became a big part of the study, was trying to find out what did we lose as we were forced onto reservation systems, and everything changed for us massively in a very short time period. So my research became a little bit more than just understanding what were my native ancestors eating, and surviving as an entire community, but also just the history of things, because no matter where we are, excuse me, in North America, like all North America's history begins with indigenous history. And it's just interesting to think that we just don't have resources, because I couldn't go online and buy Joy of Native American Cooking, you know, on Amazon, because that didn't exist. And, you know, I just really wanted to define philosophy around what were Native American foods. So, you know, I started really practicing indigenous foods in the probably around 2009 approximately. But, you know, my philosophy was just trying to showcase what was around us. You know, I was in the Great Lakes region, so I wanted to just showcase what are the native foods, so proteins, what kind of agriculture, what kind of wild foods, and really putting together plates and knowledge to tell a story for whoever came to some of these pop-up dinners I was doing. And so I removed things that were introduced. I removed colonial ingredients. So there's no dairy, there's no wheat flour, there's no cane sugar, there's no beef, pork, or chicken, there's no Jello molds. And I just really wanted to focus on the foods of where we happen to be. And as I really started to understand more and more about my Lakota ancestry, I started really understanding more about some of the surrounding tribes. And today we're looking at all of North America. We're looking at Mexico through Alaska and the immense amount of indigeneity that's out there. And we even look at it as a global situation. But as I started this journey, you know, opening my company in 2014, in those early days, a lot of the press just had a lot of really interesting questions, because most people hadn't really thought about Native American foods, and the question would always be, oh, Native American foods, weird, what is that? Never heard of it, you know, because there's no native restaurants, you know, there's no, you know, it's hard to find any books on the subject, especially back then. There were no native chefs out there. There's no native cooking shows. So it just, you know, it's just complete invisibility. So I started really just kind of teaching people a little bit and doing a lot of these talks. And I've done talks all over the world over the past few years, since 2014. And I travel a lot to share this. I go to tribal communities, I go to universities, I go to school systems, I go to food conferences. I'm going to be I'm working with the USDA. I'll be in Washington, D.C. this next weekend, and working there this early next week. And we just do a lot. So a lot of this is education, and it's just trying to teach people about what's possible with understanding indigenous foods, because indigenous peoples around the globe had the blueprint to live sustainably, utilizing primarily plant knowledge of wherever they might be. So as I was going on this journey, I realized that when I was utilizing terms like pre-colonial foods, pre-reservation foods, or what does it mean to decolonize, and what is that a bad thing? What does it even mean? So I like to just start at the very beginning and just kind of go from there as we talk through this. But to really understand what are pre-colonial foods, you have to understand what is the definition of the word colonialism, and it helps to understand the reason why we don't have Native American restaurants in every single region in every single city. So colonialism is simply the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying with settlers and exploiting it economically. This, of course, is not unique to North America because it's happened all across the globe, primarily coming out of European powers, but North America, South America, Africa, the Middle East, India, Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii, you name it, it's been all over the place. And for people of color around the globe, we go through a very short time period of human history as indigenous peoples from everywhere, and so much violence, so much damage to our cultures, and we really just go through centuries of racism and white supremacy based on things like doctrine of discovery, for example, which basically gave European powers the okay to claim and take ownership of land and people and resources if they were non-Christianized areas. And our history teaches us very little about the time period in American history. A lot of people know because of things like the 1619 Project that really highlight, the 12.5 million indigenous African people that are forced over to the United States to build a massive amount of what is the United States. But also there in that time period, there's also 5.5 million indigenous peoples inside that slave situation. And we have to remember how little history we have in the United States, because in the year 1800, we're really not much more than still the 13 colonies. Ohio is basically the western frontier at that time period. And this century between 1800 and 1900 is really the story that sets the tone for where we are today. So one of the first things that happens with this very young new government in the late 1700s is the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which basically gives the justification of taking land spaces that are occupied and stewarded by indigenous communities, and then the young United States government realizes right away, of course, that it can commodify these land grabs and basically sell it, and the United States makes an immense amount of wealth, as do the leaders of this newly formed government. And we slowly start to see over this century massive land grabs. Obviously, European countries had long been taking over huge land spaces, but the reality is that indigenous peoples are still occupying and stewarding most of this land space, and many indigenous communities at this point in history haven't even seen indigenous peoples. And we have to remember, we don't even see the definition of the colonial borders until the middle of the 1800s, when the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo happens in 1848, which defines the southern border, what is now U.S. Mexico. So this little video just shows very quickly, during this time period, how quickly land spaces disappear from indigenous communities. And we have to think about the intensity, what that means to indigenous peoples, with so much forced migration, just pushing people into other areas, just loss of culture. Genocide is actively happening. States like California wipe out over 90% of its population just within a couple of decades between the 1850s and 1860s. In California, there's a bounty system where there's up to $200 for the body part of an indigenous person, and they pay out a massive amount of wealth for this genocide that happens. There's even a book out there called American Genocide that chronicles details of just instances of genocide in California alone during that time period. In the 1870s, they do a census, and there's less than 15,000 indigenous peoples left alive in that state. There's also bounty systems in places like where I currently live in Minnesota during the 1860s. We, as indigenous people, we see, because of the full colonial machine happening across what is America, we see just so much environmental destruction, because it's just relentless. There's very little rules about it. And we just see massive forests and areas being ripped down, lumber barons coming out of it. And I can only imagine what the nation would look like if we had some of these resources of all this extremely old growth forests that had been there for forever, and all the indigenous communities that had been stewarding these regions. And as so much agriculture is so vibrant across what is North America, starting from the bottom of Mexico, moving all the way throughout Mexico, throughout the Caribbean, throughout the entire eastern seaboard, up the Mississippi and Missouri River valleys, and everywhere in between, there's just so much advanced agriculture happening in so many areas during this time period. And we see so much destruction of crops and seeds, and it really sets the tone from the very first president of the United States, George Washington, because one of his first actions is ordering General Sullivan to basically, his order is the total destruction and devastation of the settlements in what is today New York. General Sullivan sets out on that campaign in 1779 over a single summer, and he writes back at the end of that summer saying, "I have done my duties. There's not a sight of a single Indian on this side of Niagara." And today in the Haudenosaunee language, in the Northeast, the literal word for U.S. president still today means town destroyer. But this just sets the tone for how leaders of the United States government treated Indigenous peoples for the rest of this upcoming century. We see things like Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act of 1830, which is better known as Trail of Tears. We see the Morrill Act of 1862, which gives a lot of the stolen land spaces to states to justify land grant universities, which really should be called land grab universities, and a lot of these universities are still profiting off a lot of these land spaces. We see the Homestead Act of 1862, the Indian Appropriation Act of 1871, the Dawes Act of 1887. And where I'm at in Minnesota, where I currently live in Minnesota, there's places like this picture, which is the camp, the concentration camp that was set up after the Dakota people tried to rise up and fight for their way of life, and all of the broken treaties. Since the U.S. government, they only honored 0 treaties with all of the tribes and all the treaties that they created. But in 1863, they passed after a short-lived battle, they passed the Dakota and Ho-Chunk Acts in 1860, Dakota and Ho-Chunk Expulsion Acts of 1863, forcing these tribes out of the confines of Minnesota. And we just see this all across this time period, especially right after the Civil War. This is a flyer from what becomes the Sand Creek Massacre, promising anybody who signs up to fight this community of Indigenous peoples outside of Denver that they can keep whatever they can. And it's one of the most horrific massacres that happened, but there's a lot of them that happened during that time period. So as Indigenous peoples, we also see just so much loss of food and food access, because there's so much encroachment, there's so much land grabbing, there's so much colonization in full effect, and settlers coming all over the place. And we do learn about how the bison was almost driven to extinction during this century, but we're not taught about how this was very intentional with the U.S. government, and there's plenty of documentation in Congress about this very situation, and the U.S. government decides to pay for the destruction of this animal, knowing it would weaken a lot of these tribes that it was having a hard time confining across the West. And there's, again, plenty of documentation out there of this story, which isn't very well known, but there's things like this in history. This one says, in 1874, United States surveying parties report that there are 2,000 hunters on the plains killing these animals for their hides. One party of only 16 hunters reported having killed 28,000 bison during the past summer. Well, what's most damaging to us, besides all of this violence and all of these actions of Congress, is really the eradication of our own Indigenous education. So if you take a moment to define what does the term Indigenous education mean, is basically an extremely diverse education situation, because there's so much diversity of Indigenous peoples everywhere. And our education systems were basically giving us, again, the tools to live sustainably, utilizing the world around us with primarily plants. Because there's so much diversity, it's hard to even say exactly what is Indigenous education, but we can start to map it out. So for my grandparents' generation, assimilation is something that really comes around, because we should have been learning about everything, about agriculture, about permaculture and wild foods, and just stewarding the land around us, hunting, and all language and religion and stories and music, and you name it. So it's my grandparents' generation that should have been downloading the full extent of this knowledge base, but instead we're forced into boarding school systems And these are really intense. So if anybody's ever been to Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania, which is now a war college for the U.S. government, it's a really intense history because these kids are forced from so many communities all across the nation, and they're forced to speak English, to change their hairstyle, they have to learn Christianity. It's a military school, so they go through an immense amount of punishment. A lot of these kids don't even survive. There's a huge graveyard there from these children, and they're just subjected to so much abuse, physical abuse, mental abuse, sexual abuse, and death. And we're still reeling from a lot of that trauma in a lot of our Indigenous communities today. We see so much, boarding schools happen all across what is the United States. Oops, I lost my screen there. Sorry, guys, 1 second. So anyways, Deb Holland this year released a big study, but this is just beginning. Like, we have a lot to understand the damage and the trauma that happens to all these children in boarding schools basically everywhere. In Alaska and Hawaii, across the US and Canada, they're called residential schools. And we did learn that very recently that they started searching the grounds at some of these residential schools in Canada, which were alive up until the 1990s, and finding hundreds and thousands of bodies eventually from just searching a few of these schools. And we haven't even attempted to start this process in the United States quite yet. But this is a huge part of where things really turn, because our entire education system is completely replaced with something that is completely different. And so that's the 1800s. And the 1900s isn't much better for us as Indigenous peoples, because we're still, at this point, we're living in reservation systems. There's a lot of racism, and reservation systems are basically segregated communities, and they still are today. We're not officially citizens until 1924, which is after my grandparents. First the males are made citizens, then the women. But at the same year, the United States government realized they didn't have rules to deal with Indigenous peoples when it came to racial bias and segregation. So they had to create the Racial Integrity Act of 1924 to justify that racism. We go through a couple of decades of Indian termination and relocation policies, which are really damaging to a lot of our Indigenous communities. And we see a huge spike in populations in urban areas in cities like Chicago, Minneapolis, Oakland, Denver, because of that. We also go through a really intense, almost 3 decades, 1941 to 1967 of the Indian adoption era, where 1 out of 3 Indigenous children are separated from their families and put into non-Indigenous homes. And if anybody has friends within Indigenous communities, you are going to know some people who have been through this adoption process. And it was really hard for these people to grow up and then try to come back to their Indigenous communities if they even know where they came from. And this was just another form of cultural genocide for us to endure as Indigenous peoples. We can't vote until many people of color until 1965, and even in states where I grew up in South Dakota, it took even longer, because they wouldn't allow votes from unorganized counties much later, up until the 80s even. We couldn't even celebrate our own religions legally until 1978, which is crazy, because the United States has always gone on about freedom of religion and just did not apply to the first peoples of the continent. And growing up in what's going on with post-colonial Native America, like, we haven't come that far. This is a picture from the last vote in the last presidential vote, where they couldn't even remember who Indigenous peoples were. They just called us something else, and we were going to use that for our tagline. Come down to Awamni in Minneapolis, we're something else. Sorry, it's a silly joke. So for me, growing up in a reservation, like, I grew up primarily with commodity foods, because I get a lot of questions as a chef. There's a lot of media around me, and people are always asking questions like, you grew up on a reservation, what did you eat? Because they want to hear a cool story. That would go out hunting in the morning, take down an elk, have a big family feast. But the reality is that we grew up very poor, and we grew up with a lot of government subsidies and foods, which we still see all over the place in school systems and hospitals, military, and of course tribal communities. And this is rough, because this food system historically has been not a lot of nutrition. It's been a lot of just super over processed foods. And I know that the USDA is doing things to move forward, and we are excited to be able to be working directly with the USDA, but we also have to just take a moment to see the damage that this food has done to us as Indigenous peoples, because growing up with things like beef with juices, chicken with juices, salmon with juices, whatever. It's just pork with juices. It's just that, it's just not good, and it shouldn't, we need nutritional food access to be healthy because our brains are attached to our bodies, and what we eat affects everything. And we see so much depression, we see so much suicide, we see so much everything, and we could really change a lot if we just had better nutritional access. So we have a long ways to go when it comes to that, but this is part of the work. And things like Indian tacos or fry bread tacos, we chose as a modern indigenous food company to go against this because we didn't have things like fry bread because we didn't have flour that was given to us through commodity foods and through a lot of these treaties, and something that was a staple for military because it's an easy thing. Like you mix some flour in some water and maybe some salt, and you fry it up, and you have something that's substance, and it tastes good. And it's become there's been a lot of family recipes, and a lot of people are very proud of fry bread recipes across Native America, but this shouldn't identify all of us as Indigenous peoples because we have so much diversity. And that's what's exciting, is to really truly understand Indigenous food systems of where we live, because if we understand Indigenous food systems, we can truly understand just where we are in the US so much better. So for me, I just spent a lot of time thinking and trying to research, because again, like, I couldn't just go online and order a book about it. I had to really try to think it through. So I studied a lot of ethnobotanical texts. I talked to a lot of elders, and I just tried to piece together a philosophy of what is modern Indigenous foods moving forward. So part of this is just understanding how diverse North America is, because we have everything from Arctic to tropics in North America, and there's mountains and plains and swamps and coastal regions and so many growing areas. And then to see the indigeneity diversity, one way to look at that is through a language map. So if you look at Indigenous language maps, you can see this diversity. So our dream is one day to help create and develop more Indigenous food businesses all across this nation. So we could, if we were driving across this nation in any direction, stop and experience the amazing and immense diversity that's out there when it comes to food, flavor, nutrition. Because every few hundred miles, you're in a different language, it's different stories, different religions, different foods, and just different growing regions. And there's just so much amazing diversity. And that's how we should be thinking about North American food, because like today there's still 634 tribes in the U.S., 634 in Canada, 574 in the U.S., and 20% of Mexico identifies as Indigenous, which are huge numbers. There's a lot of indigeneity still alive despite the intense violence across the 1800s. And there's zero comparison when it comes to looking at colonial settler states versus Indigenous territories, knowing that Indigenous territories are very fluid, but still it doesn't matter who's speaking Spanish or English or French. Those are all European colonial languages. English is a foreign language in North America. So focusing on Indigenous education, it's again, like, this is more than just trying to understand foods. It's more than understanding a chef in a restaurant. It's understanding how entire communities had survived for so long, utilizing true sense of food sovereignty. So it's a huge knowledge of all these pieces: wild foods, permaculture, agriculture, seed saving, seasonal lifestyles, ethno-oceanography, hunting, fishing, whole animal butchery, mycology, salt, sugar, fat productions, crafting, land stewardships, cooking techniques, metallurgy, Indigenous history, star knowledge, traditional medicines, food preservation, fermentation, nutrition, health, spirituality, gender roles. These are pieces of our knowledge bases, and these are all commonalities that we have as Indigenous peoples everywhere, even though there's a lot of diversity here. So understanding simple things like what were we eating, basically we learn. One thing we do learn in school is how Native Americans, very generalized, were able to utilize all parts of the bison, but that's because we had to be extremely resourceful as Indigenous peoples, and we had countless generations and the privilege of having countless generations behind us, giving us the knowledge of knowing what to do with every single part of this animal. But we applied that to many different animals and plants because, again, we had that privilege of knowing what to do with all this resources and all these byproducts. And we just didn't have the privilege to be wasteful like we do today, where we literally buy something and throw it away moments later. Like, we create so much waste, and we should all be working towards becoming more resourceful in basically everything. And we should not be afraid of proteins if it doesn't happen to be a cow, a pig, or a chicken, because literally everything out there it can be game if people are eating proteins. And even insect usage, like which is so normal in so many parts of the world, should not be a weird thing for people to try. I put crickets on our menu in Minneapolis, and we're probably going through about 15 pounds of crickets a day, and people like them because we can make them taste good, and it's not that scary. For me, what really helped me connect with my ancestry is just the knowledge of plants, because again, the knowledge of our environment is so immense. So if you take the time to stop calling everything a weed and start to learn what's around you, you're going to see nothing but food and medicine everywhere. And there's so much of it. There's so much nutrition around us. And we can do so much better teaching some of these educations. I always tease that our kids can name more of Kim Kardashian's ex-boyfriends than they can tree species, because that's true. Like, we should really be focused on what kind of education is really important for all of us as humans when it comes down to it, and just understanding some of the building blocks that we need as humans to survive and what's out there. This is a plant called Timsala in Lakota language. It's a wild prairie turnip. We harvested this, and it's pretty normal to see a lot of these in Lakota family homes still today. We have things like the camas root in the Pacific Northwest, the Great Basin, California, all over that whole region. Or if you're in the Great Lakes region, where we have the true wild rice that still grows out there. But you have to understand why so many tribal communities and organizations spend so much time and resources trying to fight big oil, because it's not a matter of if those pipelines leak, but when and how much damage will be left behind, and will our grandchildren have access to some of these amazing foods that we're already struggling with because of climate change. And that knowledge of water plants in general is huge, because so many tribal coastal regions, obviously everybody there had an immense knowledge of the world outside of what's in the ocean. So many plants, so many sea mammals, so many mollusks and fish and everything. Or if you're in the deserts where all the plants look like they want to hurt you or maim you, indigenous people saw nothing but food everywhere. And it's almost kind of silly to use the term food desert, because people that lived in the desert knew how to look around and saw that food everywhere too. So we just have a lot of education, and we have to understand how plants work and not overharvest. And it shouldn't just be about that colonial mindset of extracting for profit, because food doesn't necessarily need to have a cash value on it. Like, food can be grown with a lot of labor and a lot of work. And when it comes to agriculture, we're taught that this is kind of the epitome of where we are, like we've come so far, but we know how damaging this actually is and how dangerous this is for this style of agriculture. And if we see like news pieces like how worried should we be that glyphosate was found in our Cheerios, like we should be very worried, because we can't get away from it. Like, this stuff is in almost everything in the middle of your grocery store. And if we look at indigenous agriculture, like I'm in the Yucatan right now, and they didn't even have open water sources. They figured out how to have giant civilizations, immense agriculture, and so much advancement and everything in architecture and just knowledge. There's just so much advancement going on there, but especially the agriculture, because they're growing out things like varietals of corns and beans and squash and chilies and cotton, tobacco, you name it. And then the same thing you see in Mexico City when the Spanish first arrived, because they're able to feed hundreds of thousands of people utilizing the same crops that the Mayans are growing, and doing it completely organically. And you can trace that corn culture moving northward and southward, of course, into South America. But focusing on North America, this is a Zuni farm in what is modern day New Mexico, where they figured out how to do this for thousands of years in the middle of the desert, and irrigating and growing, a different farming style. They're using what's called a waffle system, but growing the same things that the Mayans are. And some people might know about Three Sisters. This is a very East Coast style of growing, where they grew the corn and the beans would crawl up the corn and the squash would grow around it. And it was very symbiotic. But again, we had so much diversity as indigenous peoples. There were so many different farming styles that came out of it also. There's a book out there called Buffalo Bird Woman's Garden. Buffalo Bird Woman is a Hidatsa woman from what is not in modern day North Dakota today. You can see the Missouri River Valley in the background of this picture. And she's using a buffalo shoulder bone hoe. And there's a book out there. That book, Buffalo Bird Woman's Garden, just chronicles a single season in the life of her garden and her memories as an elder at the turn of the century, and how she grew up a Hidatsa farmer without ever seeing without even seeing European people till much, much later. And there's so many beautiful stories that come out of that text, because it's a very unique look at North American indigenous agriculture, and it's really well documented with all the different varietals. And she's growing the same things that they were way down in Mexico because of how that farming spread. So we have to remember, like, we have to be protecting a lot of these seed pieces, because these seeds come from very particular communities and have so many stories and deep connections to us as indigenous peoples. And indigenous peoples really should be the ones stewarding these seeds, because they have those connections. They know the stories. They are a part of us. They're a part of our families, and we have that relation with them. And we need to be able to maintain that amazing biodiversity that's out there. And again, not just think of it about growing these cool things for profit. Like, we just want to be able to keep these things alive for future generations when it comes down to it, and for health. So there's so much that we have to do to steward a lot of this indigeneity diversity that's still out there. So for us, it's just trying to understand all the stuff that's happened to us as Indigenous peoples and trying to figure out, how do we move forward? How do we pay homage to our ancestry, and really respect everything that they had to go through just for us to be here alive today? And we live in such a unique world because, like, we could, we have so many resources at our hand. We can literally take a picture of a plant and it'll tell us what it is. And we just want to show people, like, there's so much bounty and beauty out there in North American foods, and we should really be utilizing our spaces so much better. And we should be thinking about creating pantries, and because we don't have to be using our grandparents' same spice rack that was handed down for a couple of generations. We could be making food taste exactly like where we are, just by harvesting things while they're in season. And it's fun to make food taste like where you happen to be, because there's so much food and flavor out there. And as chefs, we get to experiment and play and make things look pretty. But again, like, we put a lot of intentionality and a lot of philosophy behind the work that we're doing. This is a picture of white cedar, puffed wild rice, cranberries, maple, rabbit. You can literally just stand in the forest around the Great Lakes region and look around and identify all those pieces right there. That's how we should be thinking about regional foods, of what's really there to give us and to showcase us. And we just want to keep things really clean and really simple, and especially just try to get these foods back into some of these tribal communities, because so many tribal communities don't even have access to their own foods. It's typically a lot of the elders that have the memories of some of these foods that we're utilizing today, because for so long it's just been gone. We have all these community centers and elder centers and youth centers, in Indigenous communities everywhere, and we're serving them awful food. There's so little nutritional access, as we're, like, suffering from. Some of our communities have upwards of 60% type 2 diabetes. You guys can look up those statistics. They're not pretty out there. So we need some huge change. We need to start to reclaim Indigenous health and culture, and food is such a great way to do it, because food is such a powerful language, and it's something that we all need. It's something that we all have in common as humans. So when I started my company, I just really wanted to focus on creating business models where we can do that. So our first food truck in Minneapolis that we created in 2015 really focused on just the foods of the Great Lakes and the Plains. So we used bison and turkey and duck and all the different kinds of lake fish and geese and antelope and venison and all sorts of, working with 4 different native farms around us across Minnesota, and working with people who are gathering a lot of the wild foods and flavors around us. And because we took away, like, dairy, wheat flour, cane sugar, and beef and pork and chicken, we're gluten-free, dairy-free, sugar-free, soy-free, pork-free. We're like an ideal diet. And that's really how the sous chef was really kind of focused, was just trying to create something that could showcase modern Indigenous foods, and also realizing that we couldn't all do this through a for-profit situation, because obviously for-profit businesses, especially food businesses, are extremely difficult and dangerous, and we needed to protect our efforts. So I created North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems, or natives.org. So we are an Indigenous 501c3, and again, our 2 main focuses are creating access to Indigenous education and creating access to Indigenous foods. So basically pushing back on the 2 fronts that was used against us as Indigenous peoples across the 1800s and even 1900s. We're doing this through a nonprofit kitchen in Minneapolis under Natives called Indigenous Food Lab, where we have created a space where we've done a lot of food relief. We're at one point making 10,000 meals a week, sending to 9 out of 11 tribes during the pandemic. And we've just created a space where we can grow a lot of young Native chefs to kind of come up in this world. We've created a model of Native American market space where our community will have access to purchasing Indigenous food products that we're curating from Indigenous producers. And we also have a classroom where we've invested into a lot of digital space, so we can hold classes on all the facets of Indigenous education, teaching about wild foods, teaching about seed saving, soil management, farming, education, language, like you name it, we're able to teach everything. But the goal is to record every single class that we do and making it accessible on the online, so we can start stewarding all of this knowledge, making it accessible that anybody wants to tap into it to learn more about Indigenous food systems. Because benefits of an Indigenous diets are just healthier fats, more diverse proteins, low carbs, low salts, immense plant diversity, a lot of organic agriculture, cultural and regional diversities, and regional and seasonal based food systems, because we just want to get towards indigenous food sovereignty, which is we need healthy food access, we need cultural food producers, we need regional food systems, and we need local control of food systems, which tribal communities have a unique situation because they can rewrite some of their food laws, because we really need non-governmental food laws in place to be able to do this properly. We need access to indigenous education, and we need environmental protection to make sure that our grandchildren and great-grandchildren will have access to some of these foods like wild rice for the next generations, which is why, again, like we work so hard trying to protect just simple things like water, because we are walking right into a water crisis right now, and we're seeing it in real time all over the place. I was just in Jackson Hole a few weeks ago, and Jackson Lake is, well, almost all mud across the way. And of course, these pipelines leak on a constant basis when it comes to those things. And we just really want to give people better education. We want to push for more community gardens. We want to help give people, especially indigenous communities, access to some of these indigenous heirloom seeds so they can keep them alive and be proud of them. And we really want to get people to really think about permacultural landscapes, because we can landscape any way we want to, and we should really be landscaping everywhere at the focus of food, and we can be utilizing volunteer situations to help gather and grow, but we also need to just think about what we're doing with our land, because lawns are stupid. Like, we have spaces in the US like Palm Springs that has 120 golf courses, and that's a huge number. Like, we don't need that, because imagine if we were utilizing this kind of effort to grow food in the middle of the desert. Like, the desert shouldn't be a green oasis like that. We should really be focused on just growing food because we need it for our population, and it shouldn't determine what zip code you live into how much nutritional access you get. And we have to be very aware of this water crisis that's coming. So some of you may or may not know what the Ogallala Aquifer is, but it's the largest body of water in North America, stemming from South Dakota down to Texas. And it's starting to just go away really fast because we're allowing companies like Nestle to just have free access to take as much as they want, just for the sole purpose of creating plastic bottles. And we just need a lot more regulations of protecting some of these resources, especially water. So our goal is to create these training, education, development, and support centers basically all over the US and urban areas everywhere, obviously starting in Minnesota, but we're already creating extensions of Indigenous Food Lab in Anchorage, Alaska, Bozeman, Montana with Montana State University, and Rapid City, South Dakota with NDN Collective there. And we're going to continue to grow into more and more spaces because we just need to we want to do everything we can to help curate more and more Indigenous food operations, especially for Indigenous communities, and just see a lot more food producers come out of it. And we also just want to train more people because we need healthy and professional kitchens and people well trained to be able to make sure that this food is healthy and safe for those communities. So it's a lot of education. And again, we got our licensing so we can be a micro-sized co-packer to help develop more Indigenous food products to get them out there on the market. Because we just believe if you control your food, you can control your destiny, which people in control know that. That's why some of these large seed and chemical companies are trying to buy up all the world's seeds, because it's a power move. They want to control all the food. And Owamni, for me, is just a proof of concept that we can have a decolonized restaurant in today's world that focuses all on healthy food. Again, we're gluten-free, dairy-free, sugar-free, soy-free, pork-free, and it's healthy. And we don't even have to call ourselves a health food restaurant. It's just the diet of where we are in North America. And just bringing a lot of attention to, again, Indigenous spaces, Indigenous peoples, Indigenous cultures, and moving forward with a lot of intentionality, trying to prioritize purchasing from Indigenous producers as much as we can locally and then nationally. And we're just giving a lot of opportunity for the next generation of young chefs to come up with whatever they want to, whatever philosophy they want to around foods. There's so much creativity out there that we can showcase. This is why chefs can be really popular and restaurants can be really important. But again, we need to see this food out there, and we need to curb the way people eat across this entire nation. So we really truly believe that Indigenous peoples on a global scale have so much to offer everybody, and we should be doing everything we can to be helping to steward Indigenous knowledge bases across the globe as much as possible, which is why we look at this as an Indigenous evolution and revolution at the same time. All right, that is my talk. Hopefully I didn't do that too fast, but I think I was about right on time, and I am going to stop sharing now.